February 27, 1943. Over the jungled ridges of New Guinea, the sun caught the polished skin of an American fighter climbing at a rate Japanese pilots could not believe. From the ground, it looked like a silver arrow piercing the blue sky, its twin booms glinting in the tropical light. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, trained to think of themselves as masters of the vertical fight, what they were seeing seemed to defy reason. The Mitsubishi Zero, pride of Japan's arsenal, had long dominated the skies of the Pacific through agility and superior training. Yet here was something different. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, flown by an unassuming young American named Richard Bong, was rewriting the laws of aerial combat. Bong, barely 22, carried himself without swagger. Fellow pilots remembered him as soft-spoken, even shy. But once in the cockpit of the Lightning, his personality transformed. He flew with a calm aggression, measuring the sky in energy and angles. Japanese aviators, accustomed to seeing American planes wilt in high-altitude contests, were astonished when the P-38 surged past them in climbs they could not follow. The Lightning's twin Allison engines roared with a relentless power that seemed mechanical sorcery compared to their own machines. What they had dismissed as heavy, clumsy, and unsuited for dogfighting revealed itself as something terrifying, a predator that could not be shaken off. The contrast was brutal. The Zero, lightweight and agile, could pirouette through the air at low speeds, its frame stripped of armor to achieve maneuverability. In the early war years, it had outflown every Allied fighter, but its virtues became vices when stacked against the P-38. At altitude, the Zero's controls stiffened, its climb slowed, and its fragile frame shuddered under stress. The Lightning, designed with turbo superchargers feeding its engines, climbed effortlessly where the Zero gasped thin air. Japanese pilots discovered too late that vertical combat, once their realm, had been taken away from them. Bong exploited this mercilessly. He learned never to enter the turning contests Japanese pilots hoped for. Instead, he carried fights into the vertical. He would climb, roll inverted, and dive through a formation, guns blazing. Then, while his opponents strained to climb after him, he would already be on the way back up, his aircraft ascending like a silver phantom. Again and again, Japanese pilots misjudged, believing they could match his ascent, only to stall, tumble, and become easy prey. Bong's marksmanship finished what the Lightning's engineering had already decided. Those who survived encounters with him carried back unsettling reports. "The American twin boomer climbs higher than we thought possible," one captured pilot admitted. "We kill one, but then another rises above us." It was not just machinery overwhelming them. It was the dawning realization that their doctrine, once unassailable, was being dismantled piece by piece. What they had trusted since 1937 no longer held true. In the skies of New Guinea, the tide had begun to turn, and Richard Bong's Lightning was the herald of that change. The Japanese Fighter Corps entered 1943 with pride still intact. They carried the legend of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, where their Zeros had shredded unprepared American squadrons. Many believed that spirit and discipline would continue to outweigh American technology. Yet when reports filtered back of a strange, twin-tailed fighter defeating them in climbs, disbelief gave way to unease. This was not an isolated skirmish. Patterns began to emerge, and names circulated. Above all, Richard Bong, the quiet ace whose P-38 Lightning seemed able to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The P-38 had been dismissed by Japanese intelligence at first. Heavy, they said, too complex. An aircraft with two engines must be a bomber escort, not a dogfighter, but their first encounters shattered this assessment. At medium altitude, the Lightning could dive faster than anything they possessed. In the vertical, it soared where the Zero faltered. When combat reports spoke of American pilots attacking from high above and then regaining altitude before defenders could react, senior officers struggled to explain it. Some blamed poor tactics. Others suggested the Americans had developed a new discipline. Few were ready to accept the truth that the Lightning was technically superior. Bong understood that superiority better than most. He flew with instinctive timing, never wasting energy in pointless maneuvers. When the Zero tried to lure him into flat turning fights, he refused. He climbed instead, leveraging his turbocharged engines to heights the Japanese could not maintain. Then he reversed Dove and struck with the concentrated fury of 4.50 caliber guns and a 20 cannon mounted in the nose. Unlike wing-mounted weapons that scattered fire across convergence ranges, the P-38's nose battery delivered a tight stream of destruction. A single burst was enough to tear a fragile Zero apart. Japanese pilots began to fear the silhouette of the Lightning as much as its firepower. The twin tail and long central pod gave it an unmistakable profile. Against the glare of the Pacific sun, its shape carried a message. Do not climb, do not chase, you cannot win. Survivors described feelings of helplessness, watching the American fighter disappear into a vertical ascent while their own engines wheezed at the edge of performance. In such moments, Bushido spirit could not bridge the gap. By late 1943, Richard Bong's reputation extended far beyond his squadron. His name appeared in communiques, his victories tallied in mess halls, and his cool demeanor became legend among fellow pilots. To his comrades, he was simply Dick Bong, the young man from Wisconsin who never boasted, who grinned sheepishly when congratulated. To Japanese aviators, he was something else entirely, a shadow that ruled the upper air, an opponent they could not match no matter their courage. In war, perception carries as much weight as reality, and the perception was devastating. America had found a weapon and a man who together denied Japan its greatest advantage. The campaign for New Guinea became the crucible in which the Lightning's legend was forged. The terrain itself was brutal, dense jungle, steep mountains, and a climate that punished machines as much as men. Japanese units, once confident masters of the region's skies, discovered that the environment now conspired against them. Their Zeros, optimized for range and agility, struggled to climb over the Owen Stanley Range with full fuel loads. The P-38, with its turbo superchargers, treated those same peaks as a stepping stone. Richard Bong and his squadron used that advantage mercilessly, striking convoys, intercepting bombers, and ambushing patrols where the enemy least expected. For Japanese crews, the shock lay not only in the Lightning's speed but in its persistence. 2 engines gave it reach beyond anything they could manage. Missions once thought safe from interception, long-haul supply runs or bombing raids against Allied bases suddenly became perilous. The Lightning appeared at distances where only Zeros were expected, its long wings carrying it farther and higher than any single-engine fighter of the era. To many Japanese pilots, it felt like an American trick, an impossibility. Yet the wrecks of shot-down bombers littered the jungles as proof. Bong's method was deceptively simple. He seldom allowed his opponents to dictate the fight. He chose altitude, position, and timing, converting those advantages into decisive strikes. In combat, he displayed a patience that contrasted sharply with the impetuous attacks favored by his adversaries. Rather than hurl himself into swirling melees, he stayed disciplined, conserving altitude until the moment came to dive with precision. When he fired, the effect was catastrophic. A Zero that might absorb scattered .30 caliber hits from older Allied fighters disintegrated under the P-38's concentrated nose battery. Psychological pressure built rapidly. Captured Japanese accounts spoke of Lightning pilots who seemed untouchable, as if shielded by armor and power beyond human reach. They noted with dread the way P-38s could absorb punishment and still return to base, riddled with holes yet flyable. By contrast, their own aircraft, lacking protection, ignited from a single well-placed burst. It created a grim imbalance. Americans could afford mistakes, Japanese could not. Every encounter carried that cruel arithmetic, and morale sank lower with each loss. Meanwhile, Bong's name became inseparable from the Lightning itself. He was not the most flamboyant of aces, yet his tally rose with astonishing speed. Each victory carried weight beyond the number. For every Zero, he downed reinforced a growing realization within Japanese squadrons that the climb, once their safe haven, now belonged to someone else. Slowly but surely, the myth of Japanese superiority was unraveling, and the twin-tailed Predator was at the center of that transformation. By early 1944, the Pacific skies carried a different rhythm. Where once Japanese formations roamed confidently, now caution guided every sortie. Reports circulated that the Americans had pilots who never seemed to tire, whose aircraft could leap skyward faster than the eye could follow. Richard Bong embodied this fear, but he was far from alone. The Lightning, when flown with discipline, turned the air war into a series of lopsided contests. The Zero's proud history of dominating in the vertical plane had ended, replaced by a bitter recognition that altitude was now an American domain. Encounters near WWII highlighted this reversal. Japanese squadrons scrambled to intercept Allied bombers, only to find themselves assaulted from above by P-38s diving out of the sun. The initial moments were devastating. Fighters crumpled under concentrated bursts before defensive maneuvers even began. Survivors who tried to climb after the intruders found themselves stalling in thin air, engines straining futilely as the Lightnings arced back upward with ease. Bong, ever calculating, excelled in these ambushes. He attacked with quick precision, then rejoined his wingmen at heights unreachable to pursuers. The emotional toll on Japanese aviators was severe. Veterans who once lectured novices on the superiority of Japanese spirit now urged caution, advising disengagement when confronted by the twin-tailed fighter. To admit such advice was itself a concession that the foundation of their doctrine had cracked. Training manuals that preached aggressive attack at all costs suddenly seemed outdated. A captured officer confessed, "It is not the courage we lack, but the means." Against this American machine, courage alone is meaningless. For American pilots, the shift was equally dramatic. Morale surged as they realized they no longer fought at a disadvantage. New arrivals, once anxious about facing seasoned opponents, drew confidence from the Lightning's performance. They studied Bong's tactics closely, learning how to manage energy, how to climb, dive, and strike without exposing themselves. His success was not only personal but instructional, shaping the conduct of entire squadrons. Still, Bong remained distinct. He did not seek publicity, nor did he revel in his growing fame. To friends, he remained the quiet farm boy who preferred home-cooked meals to military ceremony. Yet when the canopy slid shut and engines roared to life, he became a relentless hunter. His victories were not achieved through recklessness, but through mastery of timing, discipline, and patience. That combination unnerved his enemies more than flamboyant displays ever could. Each clash reinforced the widening gap between two air forces. Japan continued to produce brave pilots, but their machines could not match what rolled off American assembly lines. For those who faced Bong's Lightning, the truth was unmistakable. The age of the Zero had passed, and a new predator ruled the sky. By mid-1944, the struggle for aerial supremacy had tilted decisively. Every confrontation exposed the widening gulf between Japanese tradition and American innovation. Nowhere was this more evident than in the running battles over the Philippines, where Richard Bong's Lightning became both weapon and symbol. Here, the Japanese clung desperately to their remaining outposts, determined to halt the American advance. Yet the very skies they once dominated had turned hostile, filled with engines that roared louder, climbed higher, and endured longer than anything they possessed. Bong had matured into the role of ace without seeking the title. He approached combat with a methodical calm that belied the chaos around him. His ability to remain detached allowed him to see opportunities others missed. While enemy fighters twisted themselves into hopeless maneuvers, he exploited altitude, converting potential energy into swift, decisive attacks. When Japanese pilots attempted to disengage, he anticipated their moves, diving after them with relentless precision. His reputation grew with every mission, whispered among Allied airmen and cursed in Japanese debriefings. For the men he fought against, the demoralization was profound. The Zero, once the embodiment of Japanese pride, seemed suddenly brittle. Its lack of armor, once justified as the cost of agility, now marked it as a liability. Its limited firepower, once adequate against slower adversaries, proved impotent against the armored Lightning. Even the sound of two Allison engines carried an ominous weight, echoing across the clouds like a herald of defeat. Pilots who heard it knew their options were few: disengage immediately or risk annihilation. The psychological strain began to reshape Japanese strategy. Missions grew shorter, engagements less daring. Entire squadrons avoided combat when reports of P-38 surfaced. This reluctance was not cowardice but survival instinct, an acknowledgement of imbalance too great to overcome. Accounts from prisoners of war revealed a chilling commonality. They no longer believed they could dictate the terms of battle. The initiative, once their most potent weapon, now rested in American hands. Amid this shifting tide, Bong's presence carried symbolic force for his fellow airmen. To them, he represented proof that the tide of war was not only turning, but accelerating. Young pilots arriving fresh from training saw in him a model of discipline and effectiveness. Veterans, weary from years of fighting, drew reassurance from his steady example. He was the embodiment of confidence without arrogance, a figure who seemed to personify the Lightning itself, powerful, precise, and unyielding. Every clash added to the growing sense of inevitability. Japan could no longer replace its losses at the rate America could. Each zero destroyed was more than a tactical victory. It was a blow against an already crumbling foundation. For Richard Bong and his P-38, the message became clear. The war of attrition had shifted, and the enemy who once believed altitude was their fortress now found that fortress stormed and claimed by another. As the final year of war unfolded, Richard Bong's legend was secured. His tally of victories rose until no American ace could surpass him, yet numbers alone did not capture his influence. What unsettled his opponents most was not the scorecard, but the manner in which he achieved it. Calm, relentless, always controlling the tempo. Japanese pilots entered combat already burdened by the knowledge that if the twin-tailed silhouette appeared above them, the contest was decided before it began. The P-38 Lightning, in Bong's hands, had stripped away the illusion that skill and spirit could compensate for technological disparity. The larger story was not merely personal triumph, but the exposure of a national truth. Japanese doctrine had been built on the supremacy of the warrior, the belief that courage and discipline outweighed material factors. For years, that creed had carried them to victory, but against America's industrial power, embodied in aircraft like the Lightning, it crumbled. Pilots who once viewed altitude as sanctuary now found it turned against them. The climb they had trusted became a trap, the very act of reaching upward serving only to highlight their limits. Bong never saw himself as a symbol, yet history cast him as one. He was the farm boy turned ace, the quiet Midwesterner who spoke softly yet flew with an unshakable certainty. His victories were celebrated across the United States, where newspapers proclaimed him a hero. But to his fellow flyers, the meaning was deeper. He showed that methodical precision, married to technological strength, could overturn even the most entrenched opponent. In a war often defined by chaos, he provided clarity. For Japanese airmen, the end came not as a single crushing battle, but as a gradual realization. Encounters with Bong's Lightning and those of his comrades taught the same brutal lesson. Courage could not carry them where machinery would not follow. Captured officers admitted that after months of facing the P-38, their men no longer believed in victory. They spoke of nightmares, of hearing the roar of twin engines in their sleep, of dreading the climb they once embraced. The transformation was complete. The hunter had become the hunted, and survival, not conquest, became their only goal. By war's end, Richard Bong stood as America's highest-scoring ace, credited with 40 aerial victories. Yet he never boasted, never claimed that his feats were solely his own. He acknowledged that his success belonged as much to the machine he flew and the men who flew beside him as to any personal skill. That humility only deepened his legend. For the Japanese pilots who faced him, he remained the embodiment of inevitability, the man whose Lightning always outclimbed, always returned, always struck from above. The story of Richard Bong and the P-38 Lightning was more than a chronicle of battles. It was a testament to the shift in modern warfare. From reliance on spirit to reliance on industry, from the individual's prowess to the collective strength of a nation's factories and engineers. In the skies of the Pacific, that shift became undeniable. For Japan's aviators, the lesson was written in smoke trails and shattered aircraft. The climb no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the Silver Lightning and to the quiet young man who turned it into a legend.